Good morning, everybody. Are you all ready to get talking about how we got the Bible? That's what we're here for today. I appreciate it. Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Really looking forward to this. What have we talked about so far? Got to get our brains going. What have we talked about?
The kind of materials the Bible was originally written
It
on.
was written on some very ancient, fragile materials that people just kind of made from natural things like plants and animal skins. And interesting. What else?
And they used scribes. And it showed, you have a picture of a person set.
Yeah. We use scribes to hand copy, hand write, and we think it was done a lot through dictation. So someone would dictate the words, and the scribes would copy it down and write it down. What else?
The methods of thought that went into the thing, whether it was word by word or thought by thought.
Oh, translations. Yes, we're going to look at that in translations here in a few weeks. The idea of you can translate languages in a couple different methods. One would be word for word, actually just translate the word straight over without a lot of care of how it reads in that language. Try and get as close to word for word you can, or thought for thought. What's the author saying? And let's translate that thought. So we talked about that different translations use those different philosophies to come to a conclusion, come to a final product. So look at that as we get into
Translating carvings of words.
Say that again?
Translating the carvings or pictures into words.
Oh yes, yeah. We were able to translate pictures into words.
Yeah.
The hieroglyphics are an example of that. Yeah. Ancient is an ancient book written in ancient languages, some of which we don't really use anymore today. Some we do. Hebrew and Aramaic are still used today, so some languages have stood the test of time. Others, like Koine Greek, is not used today. So these are ancient languages written on ancient methods, written over a very long period of time. What kind of period of time are we talking about? From the very first writings of the Bible to the last. What do you think the period of time is there? About 1,600 years. 1,600 years. 15 to 1,600, somewhere in that range. An ancient book, ancient languages, ancient materials, long period of time, written by people a long time ago. If you're asking yourself, I came here to learn about how we got the Bible, we're going to find out today. Today, this chapter, Manuscripts New Testament, is where we got the Bible that you have in your hands right now. Every Bible translation in this room can trace its origins directly or indirectly to what we're going to talk about today. The manuscripts that we have access to today are the origins of this. Okay? Nobody just sat down one day and said, I'm going to dictate this thing. This is a compilation of a lot of work over centuries. Not only centuries to write it, but centuries to translate it, compile it, figure out what's going to stay, figure out what's going to go out. Remember we talked about the end of Mark a couple weeks ago? Great example, right? A lot of debate over, does that, 7 or 8 verse, whatever that is, 15 verse passage there, should it stay? Right? A lot of debate about that. Imagine whole books being left out. Whole books being kept in. Right? It starts with this conversation right here, manuscripts of the New Testament. Okay, so we're going to look at the New Testament. This is probably the most, I would say, debated part of the Bible. Right? The Old Testament, when we're looking at restoring the Old Testament, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, those Hebrew texts are unchanged for 3,500 years. I mean, they've done an amazing job of preserving it, word for word. It is exact. And we have evidence that. We'll find out what that is. The New Testament, a little different. A lot of writing, very condensed period of time, so it was just like this huge explosion of writing. But there wasn't a process like the Hebrews had to preserve. It was done more of an ad hoc. So somebody had to look at a lot of manuscripts, a lot of writings, and figure out what is authentic and what isn't authentic, what's inspired, what's not inspired, what should stay, what should not stay. And it all goes to this conversation right here about manuscripts for the New Testament. So, here we go. You ready? Buckle your chin straps. You ready, Larry? All right. So, again, everybody should have an outline. George, I think's got something back there. Anybody need any? We all good? Okay, so we talked about the fact that earlier writings were written on materials that didn't last very long. So they tended to disintegrate, and that is problematic over time because now I don't know Imagine this was the only copy of the Bible that you have access to. And it's 800 years old. It's written in natural organic materials that are going to degrade. What's this thing? What are you going to have in your hand?
Dust.
You're going to have incomplete, right, fragments. You're going to have partial. You're going to have things stuffed in. You're going to have papers crinkled. You're going to have writing is fading. It's really hard. So wouldn't it be great if I had about 800 of these that I could compare and figure out what is the total story? That's the story of this right here. Okay, we don't have just one. We have a lot of incompletes that together give you a big picture of what it is I'm looking at. Okay, so just imagine these. That's why we talk about these ancient materials and these ancient concepts, because it provides what we have today. So there are two major categories of manuscripts. Uncials, which are written in capital letters, and you'll see there's an example of what an uncial would look like in English down below on your page here. There's about 650 of these in total. So what are these things? Well, a manuscript is a early Christian copy in Greek. That's what we mean by a manuscript. It's they made lots of copies in the original Greek by hand. That's what we consider to be a manuscript. So in Bible terms, it's a document in the original tongue, in the original Koine Greek. This is not a manuscript. What is this? It's a Bible, but what is it?
Book.
It's
Translation.
a translation. Somebody translated this hopefully from some manuscripts. But there are some translations out there that did not get translated from manuscripts. Some got translated from translations. All right? I can take this Bible right here and say, I'm going to rewrite this in Drew's Living Word Translation, 2021, right? That's a translation of what someone else already did. You're taking my word that I'm going to understand it and simplify it, right? But there's translations that are like that. I'm not saying they're good or bad, it's just that's how they're written. We want to go, in my mind, let's think about back to as far back as you can go, the manuscript level. That is a copy in the original tongue, in the original language that was written in. Okay? Remember we said a couple weeks ago, we don't have original copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, Romans, 2 Corinthians. We don't have the originals. We have our copies of those in the original language. All right? We have a lot of them, about 650 of these. So that's good. You also, if I only had one or two, I'd feel kind of, right? I'd be like, let's just hang on a second. How do I know what validates that, right? The more copies I have of it in the original tongue that date back close in time start to validate it. That's where that whole process, that's how I know I have confidence, is I have a lot of validation. Okay. So many have notes that denote the time of the date of the writing, and that's really good. So I mean, it's just like anything. I open up this book right here, open this Bible, and what's it saying here? Usually on the first couple pages. Copyright. Telling me when it was printed, where it was printed at. Tells me a little bit about it. And I can have some confidence based on who published this thing. Is it reputable? Right? Or is this Larry's publisher? Right? Is there a reputable publisher? When and where was it done? Right? Same thing with some of these uncials, right? There are dates on there that tell us who made the copy, when it was done. And then you have these cursives or minuscules, and those are written in obviously a cursive, right? Not like you see the uncial at the bottom. So think about cursive versus uncial. If you're going to do a translation of the Bible, what gives you the most confidence? What are you probably going to rely on?
Uncials.
Probably an uncial. Why is that, George? What do you think?
Because they're easier to see. I mean, you look at my handwriting versus someone else's, you may have trouble figuring it out.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? What is that?
Is that an E or something else?
Right. We're trying to be exact, right? We have doctrine based on gender pronouns in here. I mean, we want to be precise, don't we? We want to be exact. So a printed word is much more, I have more confidence in that, right? So now, I use their cursives, right? I'll use those. Validation, again, is it validating it? Is it upholding it? Is it holding it up? Or is it challenging it, right? What is it doing? So it's like a lot of copies. I can have confidence in the quantity is better. Now, the thing is about these uncials, there's a ton of them. About 5,300 of both types in existence. So these cursives, I mean, they're somewhere in the 2,000 or 3,000 range. I got up here in a minute. on the slide. There's a lot of curses, tons and tons and tons of them. These are people making copies on their own, right? These are people out just like cranking out copies. They're not necessarily professional scribe type text. They're fragments, they're chunks. Maybe just a book, or maybe half a book, or maybe a few chapters. Cursive writing, right? You have a lot of them that are in the ancient tongue, very, very old. Yes, sir?
The uncials are probably older as well.
Yeah, yes, the cursives generally tend to be later in date. Yes, exactly right. The uncials that we rely on, that we look at as are authentic and reliable, are usually around the oldest. That's true. Yeah. So, uncials written in capital letters. It's about 95 of them that are in papyrus. 270 are called lectionaries, which are designed and meant to be read in public. Hence the capital letters, the printed, right, big letters, right. Not, you know, if I'm going to read something, if I'm going to go up and do a lesson, am I handwriting my lesson?
You know,
What am I doing? What am I doing?
On the computer.
On the computer, right? I'm going to print it in a big font that I can read. So it's the same thing, right? And so they designed these to be read in worship. That's why that's why they exist. They were copies written to be read in a public forum. You see some of the numbers here and the dates. 3rd and 4th century. 3rd and 4th century is the 200s and 300s. Just so you know, the year 50 was the 1st century. So you always kind of right. So this is in the 2 to 300 AD period of time up until about the 900s. And then lots of cursives and minuscules, right? Much larger group of manuscripts. Both total about 5,300 of both types, and most minuscules date from around the 9th to 16th century. So, like I said, they're much, much older. Most do not contain the entire New Testament. There's only a few that contain the entire New Testament that we have today. That's kind of interesting. You know, it wasn't like we have this huge catalog of New Testaments floating around, right? That are that old. They're fragments. So we have to be kind of looking forward. We're kind of foreshadowing here. There's going to be a whole effort come a few hundred years from now to figure out how do these compile, what goes in, what gets left out, what order should they be in, how do we categorize them. All that kind of work has to be done because these are fragmented works, right? These are fragmented books in fragments. So about total about 5,300 of both types. And probably circulated right at first, and then they would be grouped into categories. And we know that the New Testament fits into 4 basic categories. We have the Gospels, the Acts and General Epistles, the Pauline Epistles, and the Book of Revelation. So, and then you see an example of what some of this unsealed writing would have looked like. So let's take a look at some of the important unseals, because these are the most important foundational elements for creating and organizing the Bible we have today. So. One of them is so again, these we talked about these 50 from Pyra manuscripts date back to about the 2nd and 4th centuries. And again, we have some that are almost complete. They're pretty close to being complete. None of them are completely intact. None of them have every book of the New Testament in its form that we have now. They all are partial in some way. So the first one, and one of the most important, is the Vatican manuscript. If you flip over to page 2, you start to see some details here. On these big 3. I call them the big 3. They really provide the foundation for our Bible today. They do a few things really, really good. So let's think about, if I'm going to have a foundation for the Bible, what do I want it to have? What is a foundational element for me to build confidence in a Bible compilation on? One is original language. Right? So it's in the original tongue, right? They're in Greek. Remember we said that? To be a manuscript, it's got to be in the original language. It's got to be mostly complete, right? In other words, it has most of the New Testament in it, most of what we know to be the Bible in it. It's not highly fragmented, but it's fairly complete. Okay? What else? I could do either one of these today in 2021, right? Couldn't I?
I think you want experts around to say, hey, this is really authentic.
It's authentic. It's old. Yeah, and it's authentic. right? So the fact that it's very, very, very old, it's getting pretty close. I mean, if we look at the Vatican manuscript here, written somewhere in the 300 time frame, 300s. That's when this manuscript was created. It's getting back there pretty good. We don't have much that's older than that. That's pretty good. So this is one of the oldest complete manuscripts in the original tongue. So we can feel pretty good that this goes. Now, the reason it's called the Vatican manuscript, that's where it's located. So, so it checks off the big boxes here, right? Contains almost all of the Old Testament and New Testament, so that's really awesome. Beginning has been lost, so you can see as far as Genesis 46, you can see a big chunk has come out. Like I said, if this thing is 1,800 years old, right? 1,700 years old. It probably 300 years into its lifespan started to really lose major chunks, right? So the beginning here has been lost, and then the ending is missing. So you can see that the two ends of this thing have disintegrated and fallen off. But it's the most exact copy of the New Testament known. I think that's really interesting. Really, really exact in that chunk, in that middle part that it has. Interesting, it does not have the passage in Mark. But a space was left for it, so we wonder, did they know of its existence, right? Did they know about it? Did they just not have a copy of it? Did they not have... We don't know why. We don't know why it wasn't captured. Maybe the manuscript that it was copied from had a fragment missing in the end, right? We don't know. But there's a space, there's an empty chunk there. So it leads you to believe they knew there was something else that could or could not be included. For some reason, they didn't include it. Okay, it's very, very interesting. The Vatican manuscript. There's a look at it. I would love to lay eyes on that. I think that's pretty cool. I'd love to see that. Again, about 71 pages are lost. So, but very, very, very important for us to look back and say, what was the original word? Again, this is a nuncio, so I can go back. I'm basically going to see printed word there. I can go back and do some checking against that. Pretty cool. The Sinaitic manuscript discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. That's where we get this name from in 1844. I think it's kind of interesting that this thing was discovered 1,500 years after its conception. It's held by the British Museum now. Dates the middle of the 4th century, so somewhere in the 300s. So this is back right there at the Vatican. It's right there. Checks it off, right? Original tongue. Very, very old. It's the oldest complete manuscript in existence today. Is not as complete as the Vatican. So there are chunks that are missing, but it's in very, very good quality, and it checks off the oldest the others. So we can definitely look at it and say, it validates. We feel that it validates most or all of it, so we can have confidence that they're both reliable, right? These are contemporaries of each other. They were created somewhere around the same time frame, in the same general area of the world there. It's the oldest complete manuscript that exists today. So if you want to look and say, let's go back as far as we can, again, maybe I have confidence in these others, I'm going to go back and see, well, what's the really, really old one say? It's kind of like if I want to do some study on World War II, and when I was young, I'm a big military history buff, and I went to church with some older guys who, man, they held the rifle, they flew the airplanes, they did it. I would go and I'd talk to these guys and hear their stories. I want to hear the authentic story. I go back as far as I can, right? I have confidence that what they're telling me is pretty good because they're all telling me kind of the same story, right? Same thing here. Go back as far as we can to validate. The Alexandrian Manuscript, mostly complete Old Testament and much of the New Testament. This is again held at the British Museum. They have all the good stuff over there, by the way. Highly recommend that trip if you can pull it off. It includes additional books at the end. This is interesting. 1st and 2nd Clement. We'll talk about that. Look at the Apocrypha, but this has some additional books. Date to the 5th century. So what starts to happen here? What's happening?
They're adding.
Yeah, it's getting older, or it's getting newer, I should say. Later, what's happening?
And they're starting to add other
There's
things.
some things being added. These very, very old ones. This is about 200 years newer than the Vatican and the Sinaitic. Okay, so about 200 years have elapsed since this was created. This manuscript was put down. And it ends up having these other books, because what happens over time? More things are discovered, right? More books are circulated, more writings are circulated, start to kind of all come together, and they find their way into these manuscripts. The guy or gal writing this thing out, he may or may not understand, fully, what they're compiling. So they're adding things. I think about, like, there's this concordance Bible over here. What's inspired about this concordance Bible? What if somebody found this Bible right here? I think it's a concordance. No, it's a concordance. Sorry, I had one. I have a concordance, an NIV concordance at home. You ever seen those? Top half of it's NIV. What's below it?
Other people's information on what they think and
Yeah.
ideas and other scripture.
Sure, you can go and make a concordance right now, right? I mean, you can go do that. And,
Yeah, that's what this one is.
there you go. So it's kind of similar. It's like,
Study Bible.
yeah, it doesn't. The stuff at the bottom doesn't understand what it is. It's somebody else's idea or thoughts, contemporary take on what this said. So it helps me, but is that? Am I putting that in the same category as the actual writing it's talking about above? Right? So those are the comments. Imagine now, 500 years go by. I have to make a decision now. When I'm looking at these old manuscripts, I got to make a decision. What is authentic? What's an add-on? What's somebody's opinion? Yeah. What's it? Is it somebody's take on this? What is that? So just imagine this job that comes along as more time goes by. So the Alexandrian, pretty good. Probably an assimilation of several volumes because it contains different writing styles. So we see something, this is a little bit different, right? Several hundred years have gone by now, so it starts to be more of a compilation of things than it is an actual intact manuscript created by one author, one writer. You start to see that, right? Because it's got different writing styles. You can see it's not written by the same person, it's probably a compilation. However, it was the first of these big three to come to light, so it heavily influenced later translations. So this Alexandrian manuscript, we talked a little bit about the Library of Alexandria a long time ago, so that was really a rich place for archiving and remember we talked about King Ptolemy, and he wanted that. What was the effort that King Ptolemy put in place? 200 BC.
Bridget,
Say again? The
Septuagint.
Septuagint. By the way, there were 72 scribes, but they just rounded to 70. So the Alexandria, a lot of good work being done there, right? A lot of good stuff. So it was kind of it's not usual to find something in that area and to find it early. Okay. So these are the big three. What do you think? What are your thoughts about that? These are the foundations. They really are. We can go to these three and say, I'm going to go check against this and see what I see there. Yeah.
Short of it being chiseled in stone, I noticed that all three of these were discovered written on vellum, which was the longest lasting medium, like say, other than stone that they had at the time.
Yeah.
So they obviously meant for these to be around for a while as opposed to disposable.
Yeah, and that's why they've lasted so long in this level of completeness, right? Yeah, the ends have fallen off a little bit, it's got to disintegrate, but the meat of that thing's hung on. Versus papyrus tend to be more fragmented, smaller writing. Besides that, the vellum, I can make it heavier, right? It's like binding. Imagine this thing in a paperback. How long is it going to last before it just disintegrates? My little rainbow Bible that I got when I was baptized, it's very soft bind. It's just collapsing, and it's 45 years old. Yeah, and it started to just disintegrate and collapse. What a nice, thick, tough binding, right? That's what vellum is. Vellum was a thick medium to write it on. It's going to last longer, right? The papyrus is good stuff. It's going to disintegrate. But it is interesting that these big, complete ones are vellum as opposed to papyrus. Yeah, they wouldn't have lasted. No way. No way to scroll at this size. Because remember, we're talking about, that's the other thing. We want complete, right? We want to make sure it's complete, not just a single book and a fragment here and there. So the only way it could really be that way is if it's on parchment. So other New Testament manuscripts. So now we've got this big three, right? The big three give us this: original tongue, complete, very old. right? So I've got lots of other manuscripts that may or may not check off all of these, but they're still good because they do some. They're very old, or they're complete, or they're tongue, but it might not be, generally the completeness is what lacks here now. And so as you look at these other manuscripts, we generally put them into 3 categories. So, because imagine, it's kind of like 3 different philosophies on how we're going to look at these, right? How we're going to perceive these manuscripts, okay? Because remember, the big 3 check off all this. These others may or may not check off all that. So start to have a philosophy of how we're going to look at these. So these 3 types, 3 philosophies are this. Alexandrian, in other words, they're associated with Alexandria and the work that was done there. They tend to be the earliest texts and considered the best form because they're so old. Western European in nature, right? They tend to come from the European area of influence, and they tend to have the most variations. All right, so they might be old in the original tongue, but actually, let's add another one. Accurate. Because that's what happens here. You start to get variations. They start to not jive. Parts will not jive. And, I don't know about you, but being a little bit of a student of translations and things like that, do you have some places you go to in the Bible the first time you get a new translation and check it out? Where do you go?
John 21,
Okay, John 21.
15 and following.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, because that's, if you read most of the translations like King James, New International Version, they all read the same. But if you look at the World English Bible,
No, I'm saying, why do you go there is what I'm asking. Why do you go there?
I think the words of Jesus are important, and if the translator thinks the words of Jesus are important, then I have confidence that
Okay.
he did the rest of it correctly.
And if they don't think the words of Jesus are important, what's it do to your confidence?
That decreases it.
Right. The rest of it may be perfectly fine, but if they take something that you feel has validity and strength and really is an underpinning foundation, if you can't get that right, I start to wonder about everything else, right? So that's what happens with these variations. We start to look at it and we say, there's enough there that I use it as check and balance, but I'm not gonna hold up the same standard as those big 3.
And there's another one in John 6.
We talked in the first week about the role of deacons. Remember that? We were talking about that, right? Some will change deacons' wives to be women. So you look at that and say, well, that's an example of variation. That's a translation variation. What if you have a variation in the original language, the original tongue, the original manuscript? I'm not talking about somebody's take on the translation. That was just a way to look at that word in Greek, right? But the original language was inactive. So it starts to have a little bit of a we're not really feeling great, right? So these Western tend to have the most variations. We tend to look at them a little skeptically. And then the Byzantine, associated with Byzantium, the Byzantine world, the Middle Ages, these are the latest of the manuscripts. So these tend to have the latest, but more accurate than the Western type. So we have this, we can look at them through these different philosophies, these 3 different lenses. So the Codex of Ephraim dates back to the 5th century, so again, pretty old. They're called a palimpsest. I think I pronounced that right. Palimpsest. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Which means it's erased and written over later. So it's kind of like, you've heard of that with like the great masters in their paintings, right? They'll make a painting and cover it over, do another painting and cover it over, do another painting. You ever heard that? No, they'll find a way to peel that off and wow, there's Mona Lisa behind here. Isn't that amazing? So a similar thing happens here. We saw lots of writing and rewriting. It was deciphered by this guy named Constantine von Tischendorf. He also he was the founder of the Sinaitic manuscripts. This guy tends to be in the right place at the right time. It had a sermon written over the text in the 12th century. It's kind of interesting. Could you imagine having a 700-year-old manuscript that you're carrying around with you, and you're like, I'm gonna wipe that out, write my sermon over top of it. That's kind of interesting, right? So this thing floated around, found this, was able to decipher and take that original, I don't know how he did it, but take the ink off and see what was written underneath of it and go, whoa, this thing underneath of it's 1,500 years old. That's pretty cool. Missing much of the Old Testament, but contains most of the New Testament. Every New Testament book is represented except 2 Thessalonians and 2 John. We're going to find out, man, when we get to the canon, 2 and 3 John were like battleground books. It's going to be interesting. You kind of see this come up over and over again where those tended to be the ones they had the most like, because we have some very old manuscripts that don't contain them. And so it tends to create that sense of confidence, because the big ones don't have it.
That had to be a heck of a sermon too. I'm thinking that he went over 45 minutes. It says it had most of the New Testament.
Yeah. I don't think the congregations that are heard in Texas Roadhouse. It probably went on for a while. Yeah. Wasn't it Paul that preached a sermon until a guy fell asleep and fell out the window or something like that? Yeah. So,
That had to be.
Could have been four.
Or
he
he
wrote
wrote
really
letters.
big. Yeah, he wrote really big letters. Yeah, that's good. I was thinking the same thing. It was either he wrote really big or he was drawing pictures too. So anyway, the Codex of Ephraim, very important, very important. Codex of Jose, named after the professor that owned it for a long time. It's located at the Cambridge Library, dates to the 5th century. So again, very, very old. That's awesome. Original tongue, very old. Contains all 4 Gospels and fragments of 3rd John. You see, so 2nd and 3rd John, when sin tend to come up, right? They come in and out, they peek in and out, right? They show up in really old manuscripts. They miss. There's fragments of it. Kind of interesting that it was written in 2 languages, Greek on the left and Latin on the right. This was somebody's effort to start to translate this. Remember what's happening here now around 400s. Is Greek the dominant language anymore? Yeah, Latin is now. Why is that, Larry? Romans. They're in charge. That's right. So let's get this in our, so let's get this in the language that people can speak. It's kind of interesting. So you had Greek on one side, Latin on the other, and that really helps me out for later on. We talked about a big Latin translation a couple weeks ago. What was that Latin translation we talked about?
The Vulgate.
The Latin Vulgate, yeah. So if I've got something here that's very, very old and it's got Greek and Latin together, I like that, right? Because it's giving me confidence in this translation, this Latin translation. I can see it side by side. It's very old. So it's when the languages were still kind of fresh, right? It does contain many verbal alterations and additional clauses, though, so it's held by some suspicion due to some unique inclusions and omissions. This is interesting. It was the only important uncial available at the time of writing in the King James translation. Man, we could study an entire quarter on the King James. Yeah, I love it. I think it's an amazing achievement. They did not have access to the stuff we have access to today. Look at the big 3. Which one of the big 3 didn't exist? The Sinaitic wasn't found until 1844, and it's the oldest complete manuscript. So the King James translator didn't have that, right? So what were they doing primarily? If this was the main manuscript available at the time of the King James writing, what were they using?
They have what they call the Textus Receptus.
What was that? What was it? Was it Latin or was it Greek? Probably Latin, right? So the King James translation, that initial work they did was predominantly translations of the translation. Keep that in mind. Now, the good news is the King James lives on, and we analyze it, and we tweaked it, and they refined it. The original King James work of 1611 is not what you're using today. That's not the King James you have. Not even close, right? They've done a lot of work. I'm not even talking about the New King James. They've just done a lot of work, because there's been things that have come along the way. But it's kind of interesting. I think it's always kind of interesting to think about. So that's But again, the work is you just don't go to one and say I'm translating this one thing. Those guys looked at all kinds of things in different languages. Has some phrasing that was found in other manuscripts, right? But not all others. So it's got some interesting, very very kind of a mosaic there of writing. So it's a representative of the Western type. What do we say about the Western type? If you look back on the previous page. They tend to have the most variations. Yeah. And variations just make me go, let's just check it. That's all. Right? Just make me check it. Right? Just makes, it's like that, I didn't throw out my New American Standard when I saw that reference there in 1 Timothy. I didn't go, pitch it, right? I went, okay, I need to keep that in mind. If you know anything about the New American Standard is essentially a highly scaled up to the New King James. So Okay. Yeah, I mean, so it's good to kind of understand where they're coming from, and what they're trying to do. If it's a word for word, it's a thought for thought, all of that builds into when you get to the translation thing. But anyway, these are the foundation for those translations that take place. So basically, after comparing it to many other manuscripts, scholars concluded it's very important, but must be used wisely. It's like a chainsaw. Very important, but use it wisely. Don't sling it around like it's a butter knife. Right? So it's the same thing here. It's just use it wisely. That's all. Codex Claromontanus dates from the 6th century, somewhere in the 500s now. Right? Contains all of Paul's letters plus Hebrews. That's interesting. You know, the big argument about who wrote Hebrews. Well, maybe a lot of it goes back to this. Here you had this compilation of really old Paul writings and Hebrews with it. What's that mean? Right? So you see kind of how these things happen. Written on vellum, Western style, similar to Codex of Jose, we just talked about. Written in both Greek and Latin. It's located in Paris. Edited by von Tischendorf. That's kind of interesting. I don't know why edited, but it's interesting. And this Jose guy owns it. So this Tischendorf and this Jose guy, they were really influential in compiling these things, organizing them, finding them, restoring them. That whole effort there to have these very old manuscripts. Codex Ladanius. This is in England again, 500 BC or 500 AD time range. Written in Greek and Latin again. It's interesting, it contains a book of Acts, but with some omissions at the end. Again, although it has Western characteristics, Greek is most in agreement with the Byzantine form, so it's kind of considered a little bit hybrid there. This is very interesting. It's the earliest manuscript that contains the eunuch's confession in Acts 8. You know, you ever wonder that when you read somebody, you probably notice that when you read, especially like the NIV will do this, right? They'll give you some footnotes saying, you know, some manuscripts don't contain this, or they'll put it in like a bracket parentheses, or maybe get some italics there. Something to indicate that, you know, this is not everywhere, right? But we are confident enough about it, we'll put it in there, but just let you know. It's kind of a thing, right? So this is the earliest book that has that. I was really kind of surprised at that. Because it's mid-500s. Those big manuscripts didn't have that. The big three. They're older than this. That's interesting. Thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that they give us the option whether we want to think it's in there or not. When they put it in the brackets or they italicize it, they put it in a notation, you make your decision. Is it a salvation method? That's what you gotta look at.
Yeah. Does it make sense? You know, to me, I always go back to that. Does it pass the eye and the sniff test?
Right. Acts 8:28.
Yeah.
Why can't I go out and do that? And that's one of those places I look at. Is right here. Say, is it in or not? Or who is the book of Hebrews? They put an author in his name. It's Paul.
Yeah, if we go back and look at which is the Codex of Jose, has a lot of things that seem kind of out of whack. So it's obvious, we look at that and we go, it's not something, I can tell it's somebody's commentary, or it's something added. I can tell, because it doesn't pass the sniff test, you know. You look at, when you read the story of Philip the eunuch there, it just flows and makes sense. Nothing jumps out and says, where'd that come from? That doesn't seem strange, that seems strange, right? So it passes the test there, right, the eyeball test. But all the old manuscripts don't contain that.
That's right. Kind of say, well, where did it come from? Did they find something else all of a
Yeah.
sudden?
What was it copied from? Because remember, this is not an original writing, and this is not, you know, Luke's writing. Luke wrote something. People made a bunch of copies of it. Copies are made of that. This is pretty old. I mean, this is 500, 550, 500. So this is, 400 some years after Luke wrote. So it's, it's getting close. What do they base it on? What do they base this on that had that? You know what I mean? So it was based on something that already had it, and that had to come from somewhere, and that had to come from somewhere. So this is all part of that job that these guys did to say, what are we going to keep, what are we not going to keep? Very interesting. Codex Regius, 8th century, so a little later now. This is the Codex of the Gospels. Alexandrian style, agrees with the Vatican, so we feel really good. I love the fact that we don't get there's no gospel book major disagreement. This stuff tends to come from epistles, the history like what Luke wrote in Acts, really tend to get this right. I don't, in all the readings I've done here, I haven't really seen anything like, this has like a weird version of Mark. You just don't, that didn't survive. It didn't make it. You know what I mean? You don't see that. The Gospels, pretty intact. Also the oldest writings, too. So the original Gospels were, except for maybe John, were pretty old. It does contain the traditional ending in Mark, along with a shorter ending. That's kind of interesting. So remember, these are copies of something. I don't know if they were copies of the original, if they were copies of copies. I don't know. They were copies of something. So you all want to keep that in mind. Our Bible is based on copies of something. A lot of copies of something. Okay? So we're looking for consensus. We're looking for make sure things line up. So it leads me to believe that Codex Regius was probably using multiple sources to make its copy, because it's got these two endings, right? So here the writer, this scribe probably has something. It's like, oh, look at this. He might have had 3 or 4. He might have had here. Look at this. Ooh, there's no ending for it. There's an ending. There's a short ending. What am I going to do? Right? So he's capturing all of it. It's kind of interesting. So the shorter ending is supported by only 3 other Greek manuscripts and a few other older versions, all of which contain the longer version as well. So this is why I don't know what the shorter ending is. It's probably just missing a few verses, or maybe it's a condensed thing. But it's not, widely held. It's only supported by 3 others, and a few short ones, a few small ones, right? And those all contain the longer version. You understand what I'm saying? So the longer version is the one that you see the most of. You only see a few having the short one. I think that's interesting. You think it's interesting? Thanks. Of course, I'm amazed by bright moving objects. So, let's see. The Freer Washington manuscript. And there's a few of these, okay, and they're all identified with a codex and a letter. So these are. It's interesting. These are like chunks and sections of the Bible, small manuscripts. That's what you've kind of seen here, right? Chunks, letter. They're chunks of letters, chunks of books. Alexandrian style, so that means it's pretty accurate, right? Pretty good. Only half of it survived, though. It's kind of interesting. Contains Paul's letters here. Contains 1 Corinthians to Hebrews. It's kind of rearranging. It's kind of interesting. You see, as these scribes were creating these manuscripts, they started the work of organizing. You see this happening? You have all these different manuscripts floating around, and I want to put them all into a big compilation. What order do I put them in? Do I put them in chronological order of event? Do I put them in order of time of writing? Do I, chunk them into authorship? How do I categorize these? You see that effort start to happen. Kind of interesting. You start to see this order happen. Because I always wonder, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, how'd you get that order? Where'd that come from? Right? And you start to see that kind of happening here as these manuscript writers making the compilation. For your codex, and then lots of minuscules. Let's just wrap up here. We're running out of time. So the minuscules. Lots and lots and lots of these. Vast majority are existing. The vast majority of existing manuscripts are minuscules. Okay, these cursive, these minuscules. About 2,800 of them are growing. They find more of them all the time. Mostly Byzantine type. That's pretty good. So you can see by the time frames on these, they're much later. Right? They're original Greek, which is cool. Okay? Accuracy is what you're shooting for. They're not complete, and they're not very old. So what do I do with these minuscules? What's the point of them?
Well, they help support the original, that's what you have. They help give you a different, it may not be complete, but we see, it's like eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
You may not see everything, but you put, there's a cop, we had a video where a guy who looked like he was illegally shot in the back, 8, 10 times. But when you put everybody's view together, he was pulling something out of his pocket like looked like a weapon.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
One vision.
Yeah, I love that.
All this together.
It's the witnessing effect. Exactly right. We were talking about that. There might be a couple people that were standing there looking at the intersection when the accident happened, but One other person a block up the street saw the car run down 100 miles an hour. Yeah, I saw that white Mustang go 100 miles an hour. Okay, I didn't see the accident necessarily. I saw the car, I saw it speeding. But, you know, so you put this whole together and it helps support the whole picture. And so, so again, because it is original tongue, right? There's some accuracy, right, in these minuscules, or else we wouldn't consider them to be worth much. So we're looking at condition. You know, none of them really have everything. So you'll see the different snapshots here, these different ones. I think it's kind of interesting. You can go do some research on these, and you'll see. I love this. Like this one says the earliest manuscript that contains the 3 heavenly witness passage in 1 John. It's kind of interesting. And just all kinds of different some variations like that kind of give you interesting. So they're important because they might contain something that, you know, validates something that's really, really old. Like you see this one here, it's very, very similar to the Vatican manuscript. The oldest of the manuscripts, look at that thing, 4th century, I mean that thing is ancient, right? So, and then the lectionaries, we talked about the lectionaries, right? They were designed to be read in public. They were arranged and, you know, produced to be easily read in public, to be set on a podium or whatever, under candlelight or something like that. They exist in both uncial and cursive form, and most are Gospels, but some contain Acts and the Epistles. It's really interesting. The Gospels was the powerful message. That was a reliable message, right? And about 2,200 of these have been enumerated, so we're finding lots of these lectionaries, right? These are in Greek. We're talking about original Greek. We're not talking about translations now. These are original Greek or Hebrew. Old Testament. What are your thoughts? The foundation, what we have are these manuscripts. Original tongue, very old, as complete as we can find, the better. As authentic and accurate as we can find, the better, right? If we find along the way and they don't check off at least 2 or 3 of these, then they tend to not be anything we think about. There's lots of stuff out there, right? Everybody in this room could go and create manuscripts, called manuscripts, but they don't meet all the criteria, so we're not going to build a translation. What are your thoughts, folks? Before we wrap up. Yes, ma'am.
I just wonder why were none of the Ethiopic Bibles or anything considered? Was it just because it wasn't around at the time that they didn't know about them?
What
The
language are they
Ethiopic
in?
Christian Bibles?
What language are they in?
Ethiopian?
Oh yeah, that would be a manuscript then.
No, but what I'm saying is, why were they not? Did they not even think about those at
For
the
what?
time?
Who
Do
didn't
you
think
know?
about it? Well, who wouldn't think about it for what purpose? What do you refer to?
When they were going back to the Bible and putting the Bibles together, is it because?
It's in Greek, we'll use it. If
Okay,
it's complete, we'll use it. If it's really old,
so
we'll use it. If it's accurate,
basically
we'll
they
use it.
were just translations of the Greek.
I assume it was probably a translation. I mean, I haven't read of any manuscript, any important manuscript that came from
The
that region.
Ethiopian area. Okay. Just curious.
Yeah.
Because they have some of the other
I-
ones like Enoch and stuff like the Book
Yeah.
of Enoch and things like
Yeah, I
that.
mean, I'm going to assume that, I don't know anything about that region, but I'm going to assume that went down there, they weren't speaking Greek and Hebrew, so it got translated into something in there.
Gotcha.
The manuscript path ends.
Okay.
Good question. Yes, sir.
We talk about all these different manuscripts, and you wonder sometimes why so many. Think about the alternative. If it only been one book,
Yeah,
by
one person.
but yeah, this was the authentic book. But through the ages, somebody could have burned it or torn it up and captured it in war.
Yeah.
But you see the providence of God working in all these different things here. That's what's amazing.
I think so, yeah. I mean, think about it. You find throughout just sit down maybe sometime after lunch today if it's raining again, and read through this and just see the revealing of these over time. Right? You see, it's not like I went back and everything is super old and it came from this one place, this one guy. There is constant discovery of things, to your point, George, that validate things that are 1,500, 1,800, 2,000, 3,000 years old. Right? So this constant discovery of old things that validate it, that's where the confidence comes from. That's how I feel. It's like we're constantly, what is left to be discovered? Who knows? Right? So to discover these things that check us off, or even fragments, give us validation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, there's no complete Old Testament there. We find fragments that validate this work, right? If I find something that's 2,000 years old, and it's Isaiah, and it's exactly the Isaiah I have in my Bible, then it's the opposite of kind of what we were talking a minute ago. It gives me confidence these guys knew what they were doing. Because look, man, here's a witness that came out of nowhere and said, that's exactly right. I saw it. Right? And so that's why I don't want one. I want them to keep coming up over and over. I love the fact that there's 5,300 of these things.
But if we have believe in a God that can create this universe, we've got to believe in a God that could make sure that His Word
And it's not
made it through for
Yeah.
everyone to have.
And I think that's how we did it.
Yeah.
I mean, and you see everything is done through man, right? It's done through us. So this is how we did it. He used our tools, our intellect, our hands, our fingers, our feet, our mouths, our eyes, our ears to make this happen. I think it's amazing. Yes, sir. Wraps up.
I think it's important to understand all of this and where it comes from as well, because one of the important points that detractors of the Bible make is that, well, it's a bunch of stories written by a bunch of guys that it just somebody assembled it. They don't look beyond that and see all of the evidences that help to correlate it, help to pull it all together. That it's not just
Right.
one guy that said,
Right.
"Hey, this." That it's backed up by all of these other manuscripts that come together and verify it.
Yeah, that 100%. That's $100. That we're done here in a second. That is absolutely it. The work and the volume of discovery and this validation effort is what makes this solid. That's the story. It's not, I have something very old, look at this, let's follow this old thing. If that's the case, we follow Homer, right? It's about the quantity, the amount of eyeballs, the amount of hands that touched it, the amount of checks and balances that went through, the span of time, and the scope. I mean, that's what it is. So I 100% agree. I stole it, one last thing.
I just wanted to say, God also had a plan that everybody could read it and understand it. That's why some of the words were changed.
Yep.
But you think if not, there's a lot of us that would really get confused trying to read it and understand what it is
Yeah.
he's saying.
You can actually try to understand in Koine Greek.
Yeah, so.
Doesn't help us today. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week where we'll talk about variations. Okay? Have a great week.